Welcome to Friendly Disruption. This is episode 14. With us today, we have a full house. It's going to be really fun. We've got Daniel McNulty and Kelly Sudding from the Patents Project out of Indiana. We're thrilled that they're here. We've got Lindsay Spears from College Community, my school, with us. And of course, Maggie and Patrick are here as well. With that, we're going to jump right in because I know we're going to have a great conversation today with this crew. So I'm going to turn it right over to Patrick to start talking about a couple of Chrome extensions that he's lined up for us to share that help students with attention issues. Is that right, Patrick? Did I get that right?
Yep. So one of these is going to be kind of a teacher-focused tool, but can be useful for students. And the other one really is for students, I think. So Mercury Reader. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. So those listening on the podcast, you can always check out the video later. So I'm going to go do that real quick. All right. So the first one's called Mercury Reader. It's a really good Chrome extension to kind of minimize what's on a website. So kind of removing those distraction, all the shiny ads and stuff on the sides. So even if I go to my own blog and it's a nice little Chrome extension, so all I have to do is click it. And what's going to do automatically is it'll remove all the pictures on the side, anything but pretty much the text and any of the main pictures in line with the text. This does make it easier to print if you want to do that. I'm not a huge fan of printing, but I know it works sometimes. But it does simplify things. And so you can easily then, if you need to print some off for a student, you can do this, or, have students have this. Even has, if you link this up your Kindle account, you can send it straight to your Kindle too for reading later. But Mercury Reader used to be called something else. I can't remember now. But it does make things a lot simpler to be able to look at things. And we have students all the time that are getting distracted by stuff on the side, or they may get distracted by links. Simplifying things like this can make it easier for them. The other one is Stay Focused. So this is kind of where, there are a lot of websites or things that can distract us. We hear a lot of people blame social media sites or anything like that for kids getting distracted, not getting the work done, stuff like that. But if you teach kids to use tools like this, they can even set their own restrictions. So what this does, again, it's a simple little Chrome extension. And when I click it, I can determine what sites I want to block for a certain time. So if I know I get easily distracted by Twitter, which I do, I can say, well, I can't go to this site for, let's say, a half an hour. So I have to focus on the work I have at hand. So I'd rather teach students how to use these tools than have to block things or have to really micromanage them, because kids can understand and they have to learn how best to help themselves learn when they're working in a digital environment. So that one, Stay Focused, all one word, without an E. That does bother me a little bit, but the other one is Mercury Reader 2, one of my favorites. I'm going to stop screen sharing. There we go.
Well, those are awesome. In fact, the Stay Focused tool, that sounds like that's right up Kevin Honeycutt's alley, because he'll talk a lot about divided attention and the neuroscience behind that. And so, that's giving kids kind of self-advocacy and executive functioning tools all at the same time, right?
Yep. I mean, we just got to teach kids how to manage their own time too, because they can figure this out. They're going to have to, because especially, one thing, I've worked at 2 separate one-to-ones, and we were able to, at my first one-to-one back at South Hamilton, even ask our graduates. We had a lot of them tell us that because of some of the ways we're teaching them how to do things, they're better prepared when they went to a college lecture hall with their laptops than their counterparts. And I know there's a lot of articles floating around in there about whether or not kids should take notes on a laptop because they're getting distracted. But honestly, if they learn how to not, control their own behavior, they end up doing a lot better.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Patrick. As always, your lifesaver with bringing up those tools. It seems like you got a bag of endless extensions, Chrome extensions. So thanks for sharing again. We appreciate that. With that, I'm going to transition it over, and we're going to start talking to Daniel and Kelly. Now, just to give everyone who is listening a little bit of a background, Lindsay and I attended a session that Kelly and Daniel put on at ATIA in Orlando, Florida in February of this year. It was maybe the best session at the whole conference. It was just outstanding. The conversation was so provocative and so strong, and so thought-provoking that, I'm still kind of occasionally processing it. And it's had a direct impact on a lot of the work we've done back at Prairie in through the spring. And I think it'll continue to impact us into next year. So with that, why don't you guys just give a little quick introduction of yourself, what you do, what Patents Project's about, just any sort of context for our listeners, and then we'll just jump right in and start talking AT and digital tools and see where it takes us.
Yeah, I'm Daniel McNulty. I'm the state director of the Patents Project in Indiana, and have been the director for 6 years and a coordinator with the Patents Project for 6 years prior to that, and a special education teacher in a K-6 classroom before that, and a paraprofessional before that. The Patents Project in the state of Indiana is what's considered a sole source provider of assistive technology and accessible educational materials and universal design for learning strategies and resources for the state's public K-12 schools. So we do a lot of technical training and professional development and consultation. We've got assistive tech lending libraries and all of the accessible materials. So the Braille, the large print, the digital textbooks, the NIMAS files, the EPUBs, the PDFs all come through us for students with print disabilities.
Yeah, and I'm Kelly Sudig, and I'm one of the 8 specialists with the Patents Project. And so there's 8 of us that cover the entire state, and we each have certain specialty areas. And so I specialize in autism and Asperger's and specific learning disabilities, Chrome accessibility, and accessible educational materials with assistive technology, integrating that in the classroom. So I love my job. It's really fun. So I'm all over the state and absolutely love it.
Yeah, it's awesome. So, you're probably like right in line with what Patrick's selling there. That's awesome. So, first off, I'll just put out the opening salvo, and we can just kind of take it from there. But I'm going to need everybody else to chime in here. One of the things that the great conversations we had in this session that I keep coming back to that really resonated to me, and that we're still having a conversation back at Prairie, back in my district, is what does it mean to be a reader? And what's assistive tech's role on that? And, and not just for the kids where these tools are essential for them to have, although, we need to make sure we take care of that, but for everybody, so what's that look like? And Lindsay, I'm going to give you an opening to talk here, because I know you've got some thoughts along these lines. And so I want to get you involved in the conversation right away.
Well, what we took away was that this discussion that we had at ATIA in your session was really just a sampling of the conversations that were going to be taking place when we went home. So it was a real eye-opener as to how different people feel about the word reading, and also very surprising that people who aren't necessarily literacy specialists or reading teachers. I have a colleague who is, more of a specialist in math, who has very strong opinions that you can't be a reader if you're not a decoder. And she has said, I have no idea even why I believe this, but I feel all of a sudden that I have a very strong opinion on it. So no one had ever really talked with her about that before. And once they had, she discovered that she had a very passionate opinion. So I think that we have been seeing that more and more the more we've opened up that discussion as a district, and our district leadership team, our administrators and teacher leaders have had an opportunity. We've provided somewhat of time and space for them to reflect on their definition of reading and why they believe that. And we were able to structure some kind of a gallery walk of definitions of reading, because there really isn't a one answer. So it's not something you can just look up and find one definition for. Everybody kind of has their own spin on it. So we had these posted and did a gallery walk, and the hope was that we could just learn what different definitions or perspectives were to broaden whatever we came in with. And we also were holding conversations at each definition along this gallery walk, and sharing with each other why we thought this aligned or didn't align and things like that. So our purpose wasn't to come up with a definition of reading as much as it was to explore our belief system around that word.
Cool.
Yeah, that's when so we work with a lot of teachers, and that's one of the largest conversations that we have when we start talking about reading. And so the first thing that we always like to start off with is just defining like what reading looks like to some people. And it's going to be different. And then having that conversation about how a student's their independent reading level is different than their comprehension level. And so in order for them to be able to continue, this is where during that session at HIA was when it started getting heated up sort of, is when we started talking about accommodations for reading, thinking if a student's comprehension level is at grade level, but their decoding skills, their independent reading level is grades below, that we should give them the appropriate combinations, and then explaining the why and what that looks like for the students. So.
Yeah, I always like to talk about 3 types of reading when I ask people to define reading for themselves. And I start with visual reading, which is what we think of typically with maybe holding a piece of paper or a printed textbook in front of our face and taking in those words, decoding them visually, and assimilating that information into our existing knowledge in our brains. Visual reading, what people probably most often think of as reading, as opposed to auditory reading, which is a term I like to encourage people to use, reading auditorily rather than listening to a book, because listening to something is very different than reading it auditorily. And to make that point, sometimes I'll do some text-to-speech of a fairly long piece of written work that's on motorcycle suspension, and it's fairly technical. And for people who have that background knowledge, they can sometimes listen to that and answer a few of my comprehension questions correctly. Otherwise, I let them listen to this, and this is a room full of highly intelligent teachers, and they can't answer one comprehension question out of that. But when I show them the text and let them read it auditorily at the same time, they can. And so I do that sometimes to drive home the point that reading auditorily actually takes more working memory, more RAM in your brain to process. And when you realize you haven't been paying attention for a few sentences, you can't look back a few sentences and reread. You have to really hold that in your mind as it happens. So my position on that is it's actually more difficult and requires deliberate and explicit instruction, just like visual reading. And then the third type of reading is tactile reading. So that would refer to things like Braille and tactile graphics.
I really like that example that you provided with that technical information regarding motorcycle suspension, and that also supports that. Is it listening comprehension? Is that a thing or something that somebody just started using that language, and then that whole idea of, is that cheating?
Right.
Because it's not always advantageous.
Right.
To do that.
Right.
I think when we start to lay it out like that, it starts to shift people's theoretical understanding, and starts to really give a deeper understanding of the use and how all of these different processes go into reading and whatever form you choose to read or you need to read. And I think that's when the light bulb starts going off. I know when we, Daniel, I don't know about you guys, but when we I know Lindsay's had this experience, when we start to lay out the UPAR results in front of our educators who may still have some of that challenge in their mindset, when we start to lay out those UPAR scores and walk through that conversation with real data and a student and a real student right in front of them, it really starts to make the connection and you see the light bulb go off. It's really powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oops. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you guys off. Well, I just think, the path this has led me down, and sitting on the meeting that Lindsay was talking about, which was really masterfully facilitated by Lindsay and a couple of other TLS people, our teacher leaders. I think the core message that I kind of took away from one of them was the idea that, it's about feedback loops, right? And the idea here is that I don't think, except in the cases where it's absolutely impossible for a kid to decode visually, we're giving up on that process of decoding. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the goal should always be to keep keep instruction, keep interventions, keep accommodations there, or accommodations is the right word, but keep interventions on target to increase that. But is oftentimes when the decoding process is such a barrier, and you can get meaning from the text in other ways, i.e. with auditory reading, as you suggest, Daniel, then why wouldn't we do that? Right. I mean, and ultimately as adults, I always say this in this, I've said this probably, we've had 14 episodes and I think I've said it 14 times, but you know, that's kind of what strength-based education is about. And it's about, you know, what we do as successful adults is play to our strengths anyway. And I know personally as a person who struggled as a reader, I was a struggling reader coming up. I know the way I learned to read was when I was in 5th and 6th grade and not decoding on my own because it was hard. Because I'm dyslexic, my mom read to me, and largely that grew my love of text and enabled me to want to read. And you know, so I think that's the big thing when we have these conversations. I don't know, and maybe that doesn't jive with what you guys see nationally or in Indiana, but certainly that's where it is locally for me.
I just met with a instructional coach in one of our buildings, and they were talking about reader identity, and they're starting to collect data on that by surveying students on how they see themselves as readers. And she is just shocked at how from kindergarten to even 2nd grade that the student's identity as a reader just drops significantly. They come in passionate and enthusiastic, and then we kind of like school it out of him. And there's this idea that you can't be a reader unless you are reading a novel, like a chapter book.
Or Lindsay, in the case of Iowa, Daniel Kelly, I don't know, I think you're working through a multi-tiered system of supports, alongside of Davis down in Florida and kind of partnering with him a little bit. But we here in the state of Iowa, we are working within a multi-tiered system of supports. And so we utilize universal screeners. And so reading for a lot of people over the last 5 years has been synonymous of readability, or their students' reading level is synonymous with their FAST scores, their universal screening scores. You know, there's a purpose behind a universal screener, and there's purpose behind a multi-tiered system. But what we're finding is when students are put into interventions, we never have the conversation around how does the student perceive themselves as a reader? How do we engage them back into looking at themselves as a reader and looking at themselves as loving text and enjoying text and getting engaged back with text? Because essentially it is that content that's laid out in text or whatever format you're choosing to read that's going to give them the ability to move forward in their education, have a robust education. And those are the conversations that I think our current multi-tiered system is lacking across the state, in my experience.
I know that in Indiana, you guys, at least I'm pretty sure this was your model, where you had the overarching UDL, and then the underside was MTSS, right, guys?
That's correct.
That's right.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about how those two play together, because that's something, and you know, we don't really, no one at the state DE in Iowa is opposed to UDL, but I think they feel like there's some fatigue initiative, and they don't want to introduce additional terminology. They don't mind supporting the concept. They just don't want the label. But talk about how those two play together in your model, because I think it's super powerful.
Yeah, sure. And it's a fairly new model for Indiana. So it'll be interesting to see how it actually plays out in real school systems. But the way I see those two philosophies is with UDL being, of course, things that are built in from the ground up to make the environment and the curriculum and materials and the strategies as accessible as possible to the widest range number of people possible without having to do anything else. It's just there if you need it, and you use it, and if you don't need it, you don't have to use it, but it's there. As opposed to MTSS being, well, so UDL, Universal Design for Learning, being a little bit more proactive in that sense, I guess, and MTSS being a little bit more reactive. because it's looking at student data, how they perform on various things, and then making decisions based on those. Whereas the decisions around UDL are all happen before, really should all happen before you even see a single student or their work. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually plays out in Indiana school districts and how they embrace those two things. Maybe my fear a little bit is that school districts will pick one or the other of those and embrace it more, because I think it's hard to take universal design for learning and make it the umbrella or make it the filter through which everything else has to pass. And if it doesn't sort of fit the UDL model, it gets kicked out. But I think schools see UDL as a very idealistic philosophy, maybe, and maybe a little bit pie in the sky, kind of too lofty, and not enough concrete things to actually try and make it a real thing. So I think we're working in Indiana to do some things to make it more concrete. And one of the things we've done is build a UDL lesson planner, a lesson creator that's free. It's available on our website, and it just uses Google Forms. But it walks a teacher or instructor through the entire process of creating a lesson that's very, very in-depth and built around universal design for learning. And so it's not a lesson planning tool that teachers are going to use for every lesson. It's just too in-depth. It's too much. But I encourage teachers to do 2 or 3 of them over the course of a school year. And once they go through that 2 or 3 times, I think they just start to think in that way. Whereas MTSS is a little bit more reactive, as I said.
Have you, I'm reading a book right now called How to Personalize Learning by Brian McClaskey, and they talk about using the UDL framework to personalize learning. And they get into like developing a learner profile and a personalized learning backpack and a personalized learning plan. And there's some kind of a paperwork process that you complete with the student. And it all looks great. But when I copy and pasted some of these tables into a Google Doc, it became like 9 pages. And then there's that question of how do you do this for every student in your class? And if you're a secondary teacher, you're seeing 120 kids a day possibly. So there's a chapter, I think it's chapter 5, goes into how you pick 4 very diverse learners in your class, and then you go through that process with those 4 and plan for those 4, and then through doing that you're able to make learning more accessible for more students. So that's the closest I've gotten to hearing about something tangible.
Yeah.
I was just gonna, I'm involved a lot in our MTSS work at our high school, just because, well, I think I'm good with the spreadsheets, and so that's why. But on the building instructional leadership team, so that's kind of it. I see that as I research more and more about UDL, that it would produce more of the tier 1, tier 2 intervention needs. Just especially because if you have a classroom where it's one pace designed for one type of learner, you're definitely going to have tier 1, tier 2 intervention needed for that. And so as you talk about personalization, I think that's where people confuse differentiation with individualization. At least having like 2, 3, 4 different avenues for students can be much more effective, and you don't really have to go to that. Like, we have high school teachers asking, like, how would I do this for 25 or 30 kids? I'm like, well, you don't. You do it for like 3, 4. And yeah, that's, as far as MTSS goes, is definitely, as you said, reactive and not always timely, even though it should be timely.
Yeah.
So and I think teachers get overwhelmed. No, go ahead, Maggie.
Go ahead. Well, no, I was just gonna. So in my time at the department, I really came to understand that a multi-tiered system is reactive in a sense, but it's ongoing reactivity, right? And so there are these guideposts, and so you're always gathering data on student learning, and you're always getting feedback, and you're always trying to shift the instruction that students are getting. I think where universal design, in my perspective, really comes into play is at core, at Universal. we can universally design, like Patrick, what you were saying, universally design for a broad range of learner need. And it may look like every kid is being successful or in the classroom are being successful but when we utilize our then universal screeners effectively, we'll still bubble up those students who are struggling with the specific skill sets, whether it's around reading or it's around math or it's around social skills, whatever our multi-tiered system is addressing. And so I think we can do both. I think we can have a proactive system and based on good design, but yet also address individual needs within that more reactive system.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And so, yeah, the infographic that you were referring to, I think Craig lists the UDL across the top, the overarching concept, and MTSS as the underarching concept, but in a circular sort of fashion, implying that it's not linear and it's not like benchmark based. It's all sort of happening at the same time.
You were getting ready to say something just a second ago, Kelly, and I'm dying to know what you were going to say.
Oh, great. The pressure's on.
I know. It's better be good, right?
Right. No, I was just going back and thinking about teachers, just talk about UDL and how it just feels like another initiative. And that's really hard for teachers to say, oh my gosh, it's just another initiative. So we like to always point out, like, you're already doing this. This is just a name for it. So then it's not so frightening, right? And then just talk about how it is the pre-planning to everything. It's just getting prepared for your class. And that's helpful. And doing trainings, because you hear the question a lot, like, well, what does it look like? Like, they want, like, Maggie, you were talking about something tangible, like, what does it look like? So, and that is where it's just giving examples when we're doing trainings and making that pause, like, well, this is why we're showing the video, or this is why we have our captions on, and just always stopping, because I think that's one struggle, is just getting that into, a school or a school district, is that it's not another initiative, but it's just, if there's just a way that we could show them a way, like, what does it look like, and knowing that they're already doing all of these things, and it's kind of makes them breathe a little bit easier.
Yeah. And I also sometimes will walk people through a district initiative inventory that kind of lists everything that they're doing. And what's interesting sometimes is different people from the same district don't even know what all the initiatives are. And there'll be like 3 people who know these 3, and these 5 people will know these other 5 initiatives, and they don't know that the other ones even exist. And so I think that adds to the overwhelm. And sometimes going through those and deciding if they're mandated, if they're tied to funding, if they're producing any results that are actually wanted, and then deciding which of those that they're currently working on fit the UDL model. And if they don't fit that UDL filter, they get tossed unless they're mandated, of course.
We've recently worked through.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Craig.
No. I want to hear what you have to say more than what I was going to say. So go.
Well, I just, so my current district, I've only been there for about a year, but we've been working through a very similar exercise. And we realized that there were, I think, over 200 different initiatives across the district. And we're serving about 17,000 students in the district. And so it's not huge, but in the state of Iowa, it's large. And so it's overwhelming for our staff. And what we started to do was we're actually working from the Marzano High Reliability Schools framework. And so everything that we do is packaged within this nice little envelope. And we can start to see where everything fits. And so it's no longer this thing over there and this thing over here, and oh, don't forget about that. It all fits. And so some exercises we've been trying to kind of work through as a district leadership team around accessibility is, where does accessibility fit? And thinking about collaboration. Well, we need to be collaborating and ensuring that we're having conversations about how we're planning and how we're addressing assessment and how it's going to be universally designed. And then looking at good, effective teaching practices. Well, of course, that needs to be, good evidence-based research and strategies. We're actually using the new art and science of teaching, but there also needs to be maybe new art and science teaching with a set of rose-colored UDL glasses, right? So utilizing and working through that, that we're also thinking about that continuum of learner need. Curriculum, instruction, assessment, that's, thinking about a viable curriculum. It fits everywhere. And so as we start to have these conversations, what I'm continually trying to have coaching conversations with my district staff about is these conversations need to happen everywhere. We need to consistently, as a district leadership team, come back to, and how are we going to make that available? And how are we going to make that available to the broad range of learners? And so it's a challenge. It's a huge challenge because I think it's a big mindset shift from historical thinking. Have you had any, sorry, go ahead, Greg.
No, I was just going to say, I'll use one of my leadership buzzwords here, but I look at UDL, and this is the language I've used with our leadership team. I view it as a coherence engine. I mean, it's a way, one of the main jobs of any leader is to build coherence. I mean, that's Michael Fullen 101. And, UDL is a framework that's, universal enough that I think that it really overlays so much of the work we do that it can bring coherence to a lot of the work. So it makes sense. The pieces start to fit. Now, the problem that we're running into, and we're frankly in the same position that the DE is that we have a very tight strategic plan, and it's really difficult to get things inserted into that plan because we're really cognizant of kind of the fragmentation factors that can step into, trying to lead a system at scale. And so, there's some reticence to actually use UDL as a framework, as I think Kelly said, is one more thing. But I think that if we looked at it through the lens of good lesson design, just great design, I think it's where you start. And to me, that's the core of this whole endeavor. If we get teachers designing, and that's a key thing here, I think we need to be clear on, is that, and this has been true, I think, for a number of years, is that, it's no longer just good enough to show up and take what's in the curriculum and just push it out there. You have to be a designer nowadays. And that includes some of this work. So I'll let somebody else talk. That's my soliloquy.
Well, I feel like we're also, we have the advantage of personalized learning being in our strategic plan, and that's our goal over 10 years. And we have just provided like a kind of a blended approach to professional learning this year through Google Classroom, and given teachers an overview on what is personalized learning. And we used students at the center. And the overwhelming feedback from that was like, this sounds amazing, but it feels really up here, like theoretical and philosophical and not tangible and actionable. Mm-hmm. So I think we could also, leverage our goal in personalized learning and fit UDL into that being more of an avenue or a route to personalization, because truly, if you look at that UDL framework, you can't personalize learning for a student without those considerations.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we just had a conversation about this not too long ago in a meeting about we just need to be better about collecting like student achievement, like what we're doing, like where's the data supporting that. And I think that is a big conversation that we have with educators is because, so how do you, where's your student achievement data? And I think that's probably one of the hardest pieces, the most important piece. Mm-hmm. And, it's why we're doing everything, but being able to have
to tie in hopefully improvements in student achievement, to tie it back to accessible materials or assistive technology or more personalized learning is really difficult, because there could be a million variables in there. And to say that, we made this thing more accessible, we gave them a version of the textbook that they could access, it just makes kind of sort of common sense that led to improved outcomes. But we don't have a whole lot of data that actually supports that.
No, and I think that's the hard part. As we've been implementing this year, we've been looking at data and thinking about instead of outcome data, which is what we want to look at and what we want to see for kids, because that's why we're doing this, right? Yeah. But instead, what we're utilizing are indicator data. So we're utilizing things to let us know, are we even, it's kind of a fidelity check. I mean, I'm talking at a district level, not necessarily teacher to student level, but it's the same thing I would do in the classroom, right? It's just trying to get a pulse, trying to get a sense, was it available? Did the student use it? Are they knowledgeable about their tools, that type of thing? But it's hard. And like you said, there's so many variables. So, so how do you go about distinguishing that then? I mean, have you guys come up with a revelation?
We were hoping you had the answer so we could totally steal it from you. No, I mean, we work, well, for me personally, in trying to pull like data in a way is just all of like student success stories. I mean, that's really, so when Daniel's like, tell us about, how it's going and, talks about achievement, and it's really hard because you just really want that really deep data that can be on a spreadsheet and say, this is why, and this is it. So right now it's the stories, the shared stories about, finding a student who, is a repeating senior and finally, gets, a test reader available to them and finally passes their test to be able to graduate. I mean, these are stories that it's helping, but to be able to.
Well, I'll tell you what, I just had lunch with my mentor last week, and he said something that stuck with me, and he does this a lot. I didn't talk to him in about a year, unfortunately. I should talk to him every day. He gave me this quote, and I think it's just awesome. He said, "Facts are forgotten, data is disregarded, but stories stick."
Yeah,
and that is like nails it.
Yeah.
And so I think oftentimes, because I spend a lot of my job also thinking about data and metrics and those sorts of things, and I'm a big believer in that. Don't get me wrong. At the same time, there's always that question of what the heck are we measuring, right? And is the metric really telling us what we value? Are we those questions are always in the forefront of my mind. So yeah, the kid did well on a standardized test. Is that really the outcome we're looking for, that we would judge to be successful? Does that reflect our values as a local culture and school system? And one of the things that I'm really focused on, and I've been working for years to get it into our strategic plan, so far somewhat unsuccessfully, unfortunately. But someday I'll be successful. Someday it's going to happen. Is to get in the National Clearinghouse data, which is ultimately the kind of the ultimate results data, right? So that's the data that says, okay, after 4 years, this number of kids is either gainfully employed or have completed 4 years of higher ed experience or are in the military. And, this is sort of data that is pretty, it's not necessarily actionable is the hard part, but it is very informative. It tells you really how are you doing systemically. And to me, that's a pretty easy thing to latch onto and to value. But, as far as what Maggie's talking about, I get it. It's just the problem is that if we get much beyond the screener data that we currently have, it gets tough. Great. Someone's calling on my phone. Hopefully my wife picks it up.
Yeah, and to kind of bring that same theory or that idea of remaining very cognizant of what it is you're trying to measure at all times, to kind of bring that full circle back to our discussion of reading, I think it's real important to well, so sometimes I'll use another example. Well, I'll put up a real simple question that says, like, what is a noun or what is a verb? And I'll put it up in a different language than my audience is a typical reader of. And using the example of, well, if you can't answer this and tell me what a noun is, we're not going to go on to talk about verbs and adverbs and adjectives because you can't tell me what a noun is based on this sentence. And so what I'm actually measuring there is their ability to decode that foreign language, not their ability to demonstrate their understanding of what a noun is. So to say we're not going to go on and teach you what verbs and adverbs and adjectives are because you don't understand nouns is a ridiculous concept. And so I think the same is true, like when we tell a student we're not going to let them use text-to-speech for biology because they can't decode they're decoding at second grade level, is ridiculous because they could very well be able to comprehend at the whatever the biology grade level is of that textbook. But to your point earlier, Craig, that the teaching of decoding for that student should happen simultaneously as well, not necessarily be abandoned.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
why.
Go ahead, Patrick.
I was just gonna say that's kind of the big thing. You know, we had some teachers when we rolled out our text-to-speech tool that we, you know, purchased for the district, and I did have some teachers come back at me a little bit, say it was a crutch in that, but I, you know, said that we're still teaching them. They're still in their AI classes. They're still getting the help in reading, but they're also in science class or in math class or in social studies, and they need this tool because it's going to be how they can learn. You know, without the reading skills keeping them from moving forward in those classes, especially when you just ask math teachers how much are students expected to read in their own classes. You know, it's still a lot, but yeah, they need that tool while they're still getting that other instructional help.
Yeah,
and I've even found that special education teachers are really struggling with this as well.
Mm-hmm.
we
Because
found that too.
so much of their career and their time with students has been so focused on remediating.
Yep.
And we feel super comfortable with that now. And we've received a ton of professional learning on that. And we have these beautifully packaged intervention materials. And that's just, you know, what we know. And then to fit this on top of it, you're like, well, then how are we going to have time to do all of this? And we can't just stop teaching them how to. So it's just a lot of, I think, building an understanding in regard to that balance with remediation and compensation, and knowing that they're different things, they have different purposes, but they are similar in that we're legally required to do both, and both provide access, and both are the responsibility of the general education and special education teachers.
Right.
So that's been a area that we're trying to focus in on.
Lindsay and Danielle and Kelly, and anybody else, I'm curious, you know, we have that conversation in my head on a weighting system, right? Like, we're going to remediate a lot and put a lot of time and energy into that when you're in elementary school, because we think that you can get there. But then when we get to high school, you know, I'll be very transparent here. We had kids in our district last year walk out not knowing how to compensate for their decoding skills. But we also are going to have that same thing this year. And so when does the conversation, yes, we need to have both conversations, but when do we get really serious about accommodating and teaching kids about their disability, teaching kids about the choices that they have to overcome the skill deficits that they do have, and how do we make them advocates for themselves?
I think it extends beyond special education then, because if you just make that part of your practice in the gen ed setting and approach it as here are tools available, and here's where I want the cognitive load in this activity or this task. So based on the task and purpose, here are the tools available to you, and let's practice using them and multiple exposures to them, so that when there's a time when you're on your own and you need to use one of those tools, you're familiar with it. So it's not just limited to students with an IEP. It's something that's universal for all students and a skill that all students can have, because in reality, as an adult, I use text-to-speech to send text messages when I don't feel like typing. I listen to books on audio when I'm bored driving. I mean, it depends on the task and purpose, and you need to be proficient in those things as an adult, whether you've had an IEP or not.
And frankly, who cares whether you listen to a text as an adult or whether you decode it? No one's going to look at your job performance and say, "Oh, you didn't decode that. You listened to it. You're getting a bad performance review." I mean, maybe there's a job out there that does that, but I haven't run across many. And so that just seems really ridiculous to me on a certain level, really counterintuitive. I will say this, and I get really passionate about this, so I'll try to rein it in as quick as I can. But the fact is that the secret sauce, I think, to all this for all of our kids, our special ed kids, from our kids who are highest need to our kids who are exceptional, is self-advocacy. And schools do an absolutely terrible job of teaching that. And if we had curriculum designed that was scoped and sequenced and instructionally and intentionally taught kids how to advocate for their strengths, we would see tremendous difference. and I can back this up with the fact that many of you have heard me tell a story, but I'll be really brief. I love High Tech High out of San Diego, charter school out of San Diego. I referenced the clearinghouse data earlier. In Iowa, roughly about 30% of the kids finish a 4-year degree who start when they start it. So we only have about a 32% finish rate at the end of 4 years. Goes up to about 40% after 5. It's pretty lousy by any standard for kids who are looking to get onto that experience. At High Tech High, they take a very good demographic slice of San Diego, so they're not just getting the kids who have sort of cultural background that dispositions them to be more successful at higher ed. Their clearinghouse data numbers look to be closer to 80%, and it's because their secret sauce is they teach self-advocacy to everybody. It's such an important thing.
It really is. And I think that, I mean, that's a great point. And I love that you shared that. And Daniel has heard this story from me a million times. And if those of you who were at ATI heard this story as well. But I think that when our students are not getting that, because like, who cares how they're getting the information as long as they can have a conversation about it, right? Because students will start to modify themselves in order to feel in an order way to fit in. And it always takes me back to the student I had who loved spaghetti. And I'll make this story really fast. So he loved spaghetti. For breakfast, lunch, and dinner, he loved spaghetti. He had a learning disability. He was on the spectrum, and he was student of the month. He was an 8th grader. So he's student of the month. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so wonderful, because this kiddo, we'll call him Johnny, really just needed some friends. And I thought I was really excited about that. So Johnny goes into school, and the teachers, administrators give him this piece of paper to fill out. And it was just information about Johnny. And I was like, oh, this is so great. So I go into the school, and there's Johnny's picture in the hallway. And it says Johnny. And then it says your favorite food. And it said fries, like F-R-I-E-S. It did not say spaghetti. And I am like, what? So I hunt Johnny down, of course. And I say, Johnny, fries, what? Spaghetti, you love spaghetti. And he said, well, I didn't know how to spell it. And that is so disheartening. And that makes me so sad, because that's what students do. They have all of these wonderful things that they want to say, and they want to spell, and they want to read. And without these accommodations, they're changing themselves, and they're not able to express who they really are. And as teachers, we're not able to get to know who they are. So then we can start bringing spaghetti in our lesson plan somehow for that piece of engagement. You know what I mean? And so that's such an important part. And that makes me so sad that it just takes something like, if he had this worksheet, and if he had word prediction software where he could just start typing, or had he just been able to use speech to text and say spaghetti, it would have popped up. And had he been, this goes back to the self-advocacy part. If that was something that was instilled in him way before, then he would know, hey, I like spaghetti and I don't know how to spell it, and how, and then maybe seek some help or something like that. So,
and not be stuck with fries.
Oh no, I said, you can't hang out with the fry guys. No, you need to hang out with the spaghetti guys. The fry guys are nothing but trouble. So we fixed that.
Well, that's a great story. That's probably a great place to end, because I want to honor everybody's time. We're pushing that 45-minute mark, but this was, as always, incredible conversation. I want to thank Daniel and Kelly so much. You guys add such richness to our conversation. You're doing such great things with Patton's project in Indiana. I mean, it's really inspiring. So thanks so much for joining us tonight. Any final words from anybody on the panel? Anything you didn't get out that you need to say before we take off?
Thanks so much for having us. We really appreciate it, and it's been a great conversation.
Yeah, and we're really excited that your team in Iowa is doing wonderful things, and you're sharing, and when you're getting charged up and excited about it, it makes us more passionate, which trickles down to students in our state. And so we really do appreciate your sharing and your excitement about things that we shared, and we're learning so much from you as well, and we are so very grateful. So thank you.
That's great.
Well, thank you all so much, and that's going to wrap episode 14 of Friendly Disruption. We hope to see you all next month. Take care, all.